The first thing I noticed when I walked through the door was that nobody looked happy to see me. 70 people, maybe more, standing in a room that smelled like expensive candles and something floral I couldn't place. My aunt was there. My cousin Deb was there. People I hadn't seen since my grandmother's funeral 6 years ago were there. And not one of them smiled when I walked in. I thought I'd read the room wrong. I thought maybe I was late. Maybe I'd interrupted something. Maybe someone had just said something awkward, and the silence was left over from that. I smoothed my dress with my palms and looked for my husband. He was standing near the back, and when our eyes met, he looked away first. That was the moment I should have turned around. I know that now. My name is Reyna. I am 32 years old, and I have been married to my husband Cole for 4 years. His parents, my in-laws, the people I have called mom and dad for half a decade, invited me to what they described as a special anniversary dinner for Cole and me, our 5th year together. They said they wanted to celebrate the milestone. They said family meant everything to them. They said a lot of things. I grew up with nothing fancy. My mother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry room until her hands cracked in winter. My father left when I was 9 and sent birthday cards with $5 bills inside until I was 12. And then the cards stopped too. I wore the same 2 pairs of jeans to school for most of 7th grade, and I learned not to talk about it. I worked my way through community college, transferred to a state university, and graduated with a degree in accounting. I wasn't the top of my class. I wasn't the bottom either. I was someone who showed up, did the work, and kept her head down because keeping your head down was the only thing I knew how to do reliably. I met Cole at a work conference. He was funny and warm, and he asked me questions and actually listened to the answers. He was the kind of person who remembered small things, that I hated cilantro, that I got motion sick in the backseat of cars, that my favorite season was late autumn when the air turned sharp and the trees went amber. He remembered all of it without being asked to. His family was different from anything I had known. His father, Robert, was a retired corporate attorney. His mother, Catherine, had never worked a day in her adult life, and described this as a choice she was proud of. They lived in a house that had a name, Hartwell, like an estate from an old novel. They had opinions about wine vintages and school districts and the right neighborhoods to live in, and they shared these opinions freely, with the confidence of people who have never been wrong about anything. I tried. I really did try. I learned to make Catherine's preferred appetizers for holidays. I asked Robert about his golf game even when I didn't care about the answer. I sent thank you notes, handwritten, after every dinner. I dressed carefully when we visited, not because I cared about looking impressive, but because I knew they were watching, and I didn't want to give them anything to talk about. It took me 2 years to realize it didn't matter. They had already made up their minds about me before I ever walked through the door of Hartwell. I was not the right kind of person for their son. I found out later that they had asked Cole, before he proposed to me, whether he was sure, whether he had thought it through, whether someone from my background could really fit into the life they had built. I found this out not from Cole, but from his younger sister Marcy, who told me at a Christmas party after 2 glasses of champagne and immediately looked like she regretted it. Cole never told me about that conversation. When I asked him about it later, he said it wasn't worth bringing up, because he hadn't listened to them. He said the right thing, I think. But I kept thinking about the conversation he didn't have with me. There were other small things. Catherine correcting the way I set the table. Robert asking Cole in front of me whether my career situation was stable. The way they talked about the neighborhood we lived in as if we had made a charming but slightly embarrassing choice. The way Catherine once said, smiling, that it was so lovely that Cole had such a generous heart. I was the charitable project in that sentence. I understood that clearly. But I told myself it was fine. I told myself it was fine. I told myself all families had friction. I told myself that Cole loved me, that we had built something real, and that whatever his parents thought of me privately was their problem to carry. I told myself that right up until the night of the anniversary dinner. Cole picked me up from work. He was quiet in the car, not his usual quiet, the comfortable kind, but something tighter. I asked him if he was all right, and he said he was tired. I asked him if he was nervous about dinner, and he said no. He kept his eyes on the road the whole drive, and I turned the radio up slightly and looked out the window and told myself I was imagining things. We arrived at Hartwell at 7. The house was lit up more than usual, cars lining the circular driveway. I remember thinking it was a lot of people for an anniversary dinner. I remember reaching for Cole's hand as we walked to the door, and I remember him taking it, and I remember wishing, in some part of myself I didn't fully acknowledge, that I didn't need to reach for it. The door opened before we knocked. Catherine was standing there in a green dress and pearls, and she was smiling the way she always smiled at me. Warm on the surface and flat underneath, like a painting of warmth. She kissed Cole on the cheek and nodded at me and said, "You look nice," and stepped aside to let us in. The living room was full. The dining room beyond it was full. All those faces turning to look at us, and the silence, that same silence I had noticed when I walked in, sitting over everything like something held in. I scanned the room for someone I knew well. My sister-in-law Marcy was near the window. Her face did something complicated when our eyes met. Something that looked like apology. I thought for one strange second that something had happened. A death. A diagnosis. Something that required gathering the whole family together with solemn faces in a brightly lit room. Robert stepped forward from the group and said, "Reyna, good. We've been waiting. Not so glad you're here. Not happy anniversary. We've been waiting." Cole's hand, which had been in mine, slipped loose. Robert asked everyone to take a seat. There were chairs arranged in a loose semicircle in the center of the room, and he gestured Cole and me toward 2 chairs at the front, and I sat down because I didn't know what else to do, and the room arranged itself around us, and it felt, in a way I could not name yet, like a courtroom. Robert stood in front of us. He had a folder in his hand. He cleared his throat. "I know this seems unusual," he said, "and I want to start by saying that everything we have done has been done out of love for our son." I remember the cold feeling that started somewhere in my chest and moved outward. The way the room had gone very still. The way Cole was looking at a point on the floor somewhere between his shoes. "We had some concerns," Robert said, "going back several years, about the foundation of this marriage, about whether Reyna was being fully transparent with Cole." He paused. He was very good at pausing for effect. The attorneys have it. "We hired someone to look into it." I heard myself say, very quietly, "I'm sorry." "We hired a private investigator," Catherine said from somewhere to my right. Her voice was gentle, which was the worst part. Gentle the way a knife wrapped in cloth is gentle. "We only wanted to protect our son." Robert opened the folder. "There are financial records here," he said. "Accounts we believe you opened without Cole's knowledge. Transfers. Amounts that we think deserve explanation." He was looking at me the way he probably looked at witnesses he was about to dismantle. "We also found records of communication with your ex-boyfriend from before your marriage. Extensive communication, over an extended period." I could hear my own heartbeat. "We wanted to bring this to light," he said, "in front of the family, because Cole deserves to know the truth. And because we love him." He held the folder out toward Cole. I don't remember making a decision to speak. I just heard my own voice. "No." Robert looked up. "No," I said again. My voice was steadier than I expected. "Cole, look at me." Cole looked up from the floor. His face was pale and miserable, and something else, something I had trouble reading. "Have you seen that folder?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "Parts of it. And you brought me here anyway, without telling me what this was." He didn't answer that at all. Robert said, "Reyna, I'd like to. I'm talking to my husband," I said. The room made a sound, not quite a gasp, something smaller than that. The sound of 70 people deciding whether to be offended or riveted. I looked at Cole. I looked at him the way you look at someone, when you need to see all the way through to the back of them, past the comfortable story you've been telling yourself. I looked at him and I understood something that I had been almost understanding for a long time. He had known about this. Not everything, maybe, but enough. He had known there was going to be something at this dinner, and he had held my hand in the car and said he was tired and turned his eyes to the road and brought me here anyway. Tell me the truth, I said, right now. In front of all of them. His jaw moved. Did you know, I said, that this was what tonight was? He looked at the folder in his father's hand. He looked at me. He said, I knew they had questions they wanted to raise. I nodded slowly. I felt something close in me, like a door. Okay, I said. Then let's talk about the accounts. Robert seemed surprised that I didn't cry. I could tell because he shuffled his papers in a way that wasn't quite composed, and Catherine's pleasant smile flickered at the edges. The accounts, I said, are mine. I opened them before we were married, and I have kept money in them because my mother taught me that a woman should always have something of her own. That is not a secret I kept from Cole. He has known about those accounts since before we got engaged. If he told you otherwise, he is either confused or lying to you, and I'll let you figure out which. Cole's face did something I couldn't entirely interpret. As for my ex-boyfriend, I said, his name is Patrick, and we text occasionally because we have mutual friends and because we are adults who ended things without hatred. If the investigator you hired found our conversations, he found 2 people discussing concert tickets and a mutual friend's wedding. That is the extent of it. I looked at Robert. He had the folder still open. I would like to know, I said, what you expected to happen tonight. He said stiffly, we expected transparency. You expected me to fall apart, I said. You expected to hand Cole that folder in front of your family and watch me humiliated into explaining myself. And then you expected Cole to have cause to end our marriage and come home. I looked at Catherine. Am I wrong? Her smile was entirely gone. Because that is the only reason, I said. To do this in front of 70 people instead of in a private room. What happened next is the part I keep returning to when I think about that night. There was movement near the back of the room. I didn't notice it at first. I was still looking at Robert, watching him recalculate, watching him search for the next move. Then I heard someone stand up, and I heard the particular sound of a chair pushed back with intention, not accident, and I turned. My mother was standing by the door to the hallway. She was in her good coat, the gray one she keeps for funerals and court dates, and she had her hands folded in front of her and her chin at the angle it gets when she has made a decision and will not be moved from it. I did not know she was there. I had not known she was coming. I had not told her about this dinner, because I hadn't known what this dinner was. Someone had called her. I found out later it was Marcy, who had figured out what her parents were planning, and who had spent 2 weeks deciding what to do about it, and had landed, finally, on making one phone call she would not regret. My mother walked to the center of the room and stopped next to me, and she looked at Robert with the expression she reserves for people who think her quiet means she has nothing to say. She said, I'd like to see those financial records. Robert blinked. The accounts you're calling suspicious, she said. I'd like to see them because I'm the one who helped Reyna open them, and I can tell you exactly what's in them and why. And I can tell you that any attorney worth his license would know that a premarital account is not marital property and is not subject to spousal disclosure requirements in this state. She tilted her head. Would you like me to continue? The room was completely silent. My mother had worked in the hospital laundry for 22 years. She had never gone to college. She had raised me by herself in a 2-bedroom apartment, where the heat went out twice every winter. She was the smartest person I have ever known, and she had spent 40 years of her life letting people who looked like Robert assume otherwise. She did not let him assume it that night. She had done her homework, my mother. She had spent 2 weeks after Marcy's call reading articles and calling a legal aid clinic and writing things down in the small notebook she keeps in her purse. She did not know everything, but she knew enough, and she knew how to sound like she knew more, and that combination turned out to be exactly sufficient. She walked Robert through, calmly and in front of his entire extended family. the reasons why everything he was planning to present was either mischaracterized, irrelevant, or flatly incorrect. He interrupted her twice. She let him finish both times, and then continued as if he had not spoken, which I think made him angrier than anything else could have. By the end of it, Catherine had sat down. Robert had closed the folder. Several people who had come to this dinner expecting a show had the uncomfortable faces of people who had gotten one they hadn't planned for. Cole was still sitting in the chair next to mine. I looked at him. He was looking at his hands. We didn't fight that night. I have had enough experience with grief to know that the moments after a rupture are often very quiet. He drove me home. I let him drive me because I didn't have another way, and we sat in the apartment that was ours together. And I made tea because I needed something to do with my hands. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once. I believed that he meant it, and I didn't know what to do with that, because being sorry doesn't reassemble something once it's broken. Being sorry is the thing you say when you have run out of other things to say. I asked him, what were you going to do if she hadn't come? He was quiet for a long time. I don't know, he said. And then, I think I was going to ask them to stop. When? I said. After. He didn't answer. That was the answer. I am not going to tell you we ended things, because that isn't what happened. I'm not going to tell you we're fine either, because that's not what happened either. What happened is that we are in the slow, uncomfortable process of figuring out whether what we have can hold the weight of what happened. Some days I think it can. Some days I sit across from him at dinner and think about the way he slipped his hand out of mine, and I don't know. What I know is this: his parents have not apologized. Robert sent an email 3 weeks later that contained the phrase "if we caused any distress," which is not an apology, which is a legal disclaimer dressed up in soft language. Catherine called Cole to ask how everything was going, which was her way of asking if the plan had worked belatedly. Neither of them asked how I was. I did not expect them to. I am to them still the same problem they tried to solve with a folder and a room full of witnesses. The fact that it didn't work does not change what they were trying to do. It doesn't change that they looked at 4 years of my life, my careful table settings and my handwritten thank you notes, and every quiet effort I made to belong to something, and decided it was worth destroying if destroying it meant getting their son back. You don't come back from understanding that about people. You just stop wasting energy expecting them to become something they aren't. My mother came over the Sunday after, and we sat in my kitchen and drank coffee, and she didn't ask me a lot of questions. She has never been a woman of a lot of questions. She asks 1 or 2 good ones and then she listens. She asked me, "Do you know why I kept that notebook?" I said I didn't. "Because I've been watching them treat you for 4 years," she said. "And I didn't know if I'd ever need it. But I kept it because I am your mother, and that is what mothers do." She said it simply, without performance. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I thought about Catherine and her green dress and her pearls and her gentle voice and her investigator's folder, and I thought about my mother in her gray coat with her small notebook and her 2 weeks of careful research. I thought about what it means to love someone, what it actually means, not what it looks like from the outside. It doesn't look like a house with a name. It doesn't look like a folder of accusations presented in front of 70 people. It looks like a woman who works double shifts writing things down in a notebook because she thinks someday her daughter might need her to know them. People ask me sometimes, now that some of this has come out, now that Marcy has told parts of it to her own friends, and those friends have talked. They ask me if I'm angry. I am. I won't pretend I'm not, but underneath the anger, underneath the part that still goes tight in my chest when I think about sitting in that chair and watching Cole look at the floor, underneath all of that, I keep coming back to something that I think is true. Nobody who is secure in love tries to take someone else's apart. Robert and Catherine spent 4 years, and a private investigator, and a folder of documents, and an audience of 70 people trying to prove that I wasn't good enough for their son. That is an enormous amount of effort. That is not what confidence looks like. That is what fear looks like. Fear dressed up in money and influence, and the particular cruelty of people who have never had to reckon with their own limitations. I feel sorry for them, sometimes. I feel sorry in the way you feel sorry for someone who has spent their whole life holding something so tightly they've forgotten that the holding has become its own kind of prison. And then I think about the folder. And I feel less sorry. And that's okay too. Cole is in therapy now. We both are, separately and then sometimes together. It is slow and uncomfortable, and nothing like the version of marriage I had imagined. The easy, comfortable version where you trust each other completely. And the hardest thing you face is a leaky faucet or a disagreement about where to spend the holidays. The therapist asked me what I needed. I said I needed to know that if something like that ever happened again, if I were ever sitting in a chair being accused in front of a room full of people, that Cole would stand up. Not later. Not eventually. Right then. He said he understood. I am still deciding if understanding is the same as being able to do it. I have been thinking a lot lately about what it means to belong somewhere. I spent a long time trying to belong to Cole's family, trying to earn my place there, trying to prove myself worthy of a seat at a table that was never quite offered to me sincerely. I think that kind of trying, when it goes on long enough, starts to hollow you out. You spend so much energy performing the person you think they want you to be, that you lose track of who you actually are. You start measuring yourself through their eyes instead of your own, and their eyes are not kind, and the measurement is always coming up short. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to belong to the people who would drive 3 hours and spend 2 weeks reading articles and stand up in a room full of strangers for me. I want to belong to the people who make room for me, without requiring me to shrink first. I am 32 years old. I have my mother. I have a few friends who have proven, in the quiet, ordinary ways that matter, that they are real. I have myself, which is something I lost for a while, and am working on getting back. That is enough to start with. It is more than enough. If you are reading this and you recognize something of yourself in it, if you have spent years in a family that asked you to prove yourself over and over without ever quite accepting the proof, I want to tell you one thing. The proving is not the problem. You are not the problem. Some families are not looking for you to succeed. They are looking for you to fail in a way that confirms what they already decided. And you can be perfect. You can set the table exactly right and send every thank you note and dress for every occasion and still walk into a room where 70 people are waiting for your humiliation. That is not something you caused. That is not something you can fix. The only thing you can do is decide, clearly and finally, that you are not going to sit in that chair and accept the terms being handed to you. You can stand up, even if the room goes quiet when you do. Even if the person next to you doesn't stand up first. You can stand up, and you can speak in a steady voice, and you can wait for your mother to walk through the door. Or you can be your own mother. Some of us have had a lot of practice at that. Either way, you are allowed to walk out of rooms that were designed to make you small. You were always allowed to do that. I just wish someone had told me sooner. I have thought a lot about cause and effect since that night at Hartwell. Not in a mystical way. Not in the way people talk about the universe balancing things out, or what goes around coming around. I mean it in the plainest possible sense. What you build, you eventually have to live inside. What you do to people, you teach people about who you are, and the truth of a person, their real truth, not the version they perform at dinner parties, has a way of becoming visible exactly when they most need it to stay hidden. Robert and Catherine spent years constructing an image of themselves as devoted parents. Generous, principled, protective. They believed that image so completely that they thought they could walk into a room with a folder full of accusations and come out looking like the reasonable ones. They thought the audience they had assembled, family, witnesses, people who had known them for decades, would see what they wanted them to see. They forgot that those same people had also been watching me for 4 years. That is the thing about sustained cruelty disguised as concern. It requires an enormous amount of maintenance. You have to keep adjusting the story, keep managing the perceptions, Keep making sure no one looks too closely at the gap between what you say you are and what you actually do. And eventually, after enough time, that gap becomes visible to everyone whether you want it to or not. My mother didn't walk into that room with anything dramatic. She had a small notebook and 2 weeks of research and 40 years of practice being underestimated by people like Robert. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She simply told the truth, clearly, in complete sentences, in front of people who had assumed she wouldn't know how. That is what intelligence actually looks like when it isn't dressed up in credentials and money. It looks like a woman who paid attention, who prepared, who showed up. I think about the choices I made in that room too. I could have cried. I could have shut down. I could have looked to Cole to rescue me and waited and discovered in real time that the rescue wasn't coming. Instead, I heard my own voice say no, and I kept talking, and I asked the questions that needed asking, even when the room went silent around me. I don't say that to sound brave. I say it because I think that moment, the decision to keep speaking when everything in me wanted to fold, was the product of something I had been building for a long time without knowing I was building it. Every time I showed up when it was hard, every time I kept going when it would have been easier to stop, every quiet year I spent in that marriage doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. None of that was wasted. It just showed up later when I needed it, in the form of a voice that didn't shake. That is what character is, I think. Not a quality you declare about yourself. A muscle you develop slowly, in small, unremarkable moments, until one day you need it and it's there. Cole is still figuring out who he is, separate from his parents' version of him. That is real work, and it is slow, and I cannot do it for him. What I know is that I am no longer willing to make myself smaller so that someone else's story about me is easier to maintain. I am 32 years old, and I have a mother who drove to a house that wasn't hers and stood up in a room full of strangers for me, without being asked. I have that. And I have myself, which I nearly lost somewhere between the thank you notes and the carefully set tables and the years of trying to earn a welcome that was never genuinely offered. You get to decide what you carry forward. That part is yours.